In the tranquil and undulating hills of the West Bank, where olive trees whisper stories of centuries past, a singular tragedy has rippled far beyond the borders of Palestine and Israel. Imagine for a moment your loved one, perhaps a son, a brother, a friend, embarking on a journey halfway around the globe, only to find themselves swept into the heart of a conflict that has defined generations. This is not just a distant headline. This is the story of Saif al-Din Kamil Abdul Karim Musalat, a young American whose life was cut tragically short in a land forever caught between hope and heartbreak. Why did a vibrant 20-year-old American lose his life in a place the world cannot seem to bring to peace? And what does his death reveal about a conflict that refuses to fade from the global stage? Saif Musalat's story begins under the bright sun of Tampa, Florida. Born and raised in a city known for its palm trees and warm beaches, Saif was, in many ways, an ordinary young man. He loved soccer, music, and spending time with friends at local cafes. Yet for Saif, there was always another world, one tied to the hills and valleys of Palestine, a world woven into his identity as a Palestinian American. Every family gathering was filled with stories about ancestral lands, traditions, and the challenges faced by relatives still living in the occupied territories. For many diasporic Palestinians in America, these stories are a lifeline to a homeland both real and imagined. In July of the year 2025, Saif made the journey to the West Bank village of Sinjil, a place nestled northeast of Ramallah. He was eager to reconnect with family, to walk in the footsteps of his ancestors, and, most importantly, to help protect his relatives' land from a surge in settler violence. Like countless young people before him, he was driven by a sense of duty and belonging. He could not have known that his visit would end in tragedy, his name joining a growing list of lives lost amid the relentless turmoil of the region. The attack on Saif was not an isolated incident. Instead, it was part of a troubling escalation that has shaken the West Bank to its core. To understand why his death made international headlines, we must step back and examine the broader context. A context defined by decades of occupation, expanding settlements, and a cycle of violence that seems impossible to break. The West Bank has stood at the epicenter of one of the world's most intractable conflicts since the Six-Day War in 1967. Following that war, Israel occupied the West Bank, a territory Palestinians consider a vital part of their future state. In the years since, Israel has established settlements, towns, and neighborhoods built on land internationally recognized as occupied. Today, these settlements are home to hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens. According to the United Nations, the expansion of these settlements is considered illegal under international law, specifically violating the Fourth Geneva Convention. Yet, year after year, new housing units are built, settlements grow, and the boundaries of Palestinian villages shrink. The consequences of this expansion are not merely legal or political. They are deeply personal and often violent. Palestinian farmers report losing access to their olive groves, which are sometimes uprooted or set ablaze. Children in villages like Sinjil grow up watching the horizon change as new fences, roads, and barriers appear. The result is a patchwork of enclaves, checkpoints, and restricted areas, making daily life unpredictable and often dangerous for Palestinians. Meanwhile, the international community, whether from Washington, Brussels, or the United Nations headquarters in New York, has issued countless statements urging restraint and an end to settlement activity. But for families living in the shadow of these settlements, such words can feel hollow, echoing across valleys with little tangible effect. To illustrate the scale of the crisis, consider this. According to United Nations data, in the month of May alone, there were more than 136 attacks by Israeli settlers in the West Bank that resulted in casualties or property damage. These attacks ranged from the torching of vehicles and fields to direct assaults on villagers and their homes. In the broader picture, since the outbreak of Israel's war on Gaza in October 2023, violence in the West Bank has surged to levels not seen in years. Israeli forces and settlers have killed at least 955 Palestinians in the West Bank during this period, a toll that includes men, women, and children, many of them civilians caught in the crossfire or targeted directly. As one United Nations expert warned, "We are witnessing a powder keg where repeated acts of violence risk tipping the region into deeper chaos." This stark assessment is echoed by local rights groups, who describe a climate of fear and impunity. These organizations point out that many settler attacks occur with little or no intervention from Israeli security forces. In some cases, witnesses allege that soldiers have stood by, or even participated, while settlers attacked Palestinian families or destroyed property. It was against this backdrop of escalating tension that Saif Musalat returned to Sinjil. The village itself is a microcosm of the broader conflict. Once known for its rolling fields and close-knit community, Sinjil has become a flashpoint in the struggle over land and identity. Recent months have seen repeated clashes between Palestinian residents and Israeli settlers, particularly around farmland bordering the settlement expansion. Israeli authorities have even erected high fences, cutting parts of Sinjil off from Route 60, a major highway running the length of the West Bank. These physical barriers are matched by deepening social and political divides. Just days after his arrival, tragedy struck. On a Friday afternoon, Saif and another young man, Mohammed al-Shalabi, a 23-year-old local, were attacked. According to multiple eyewitnesses and reports from the Palestinian Health Ministry, Saif was beaten by a group of settlers, while Mohammed was shot in the chest. Shockingly, both men were left without medical assistance for hours. Saif's family claims that settlers deliberately blocked ambulances and paramedics for more than 3 hours, refusing to allow them through the makeshift roadblocks. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The grief that swept through Sinjil was profound, marked by scenes of anguish and defiance at the funeral, where hundreds of mourners carried the bodies of the two young men through the streets, Palestinian flags draped over their coffins. Saif's family, devastated by the loss, quickly called for justice. Through their lawyer, Diana Halum, they demanded that the United States government launch an urgent and immediate investigation into Saif's death. "We demand that the authorities hold the Israeli settlers who killed Saif accountable for their crimes. We demand justice," the family said in a statement. The United States State Department has acknowledged reports of Saif's death, but so far, official comments have remained guarded. This muted response has not gone unnoticed by the family, their supporters, and activists across the globe, who are now calling for greater accountability and transparency. But what does justice look like in the West Bank? Here, the pursuit of accountability is fraught with obstacles. Human rights organizations, both Palestinian and international, have long documented a pattern of impunity when it comes to settler violence. According to the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din, for example, only a small fraction of complaints filed by Palestinians regarding settler violence ever result in indictments, let alone convictions. In fact, in some years, as few as 2% of reported cases have led to prosecution. This pattern, critics argue, sends a dangerous message that violence against Palestinians can be committed with little fear of legal consequence. The problem is further compounded by the complex relationship between settlers and the Israeli military. In the West Bank, Israeli forces are responsible for maintaining order and security. However, numerous reports have highlighted situations where soldiers have not intervened to protect Palestinian civilians, or worse, have actively participated in or facilitated attacks. This blurred line between state authority and vigilante violence makes it even more difficult for families like Saif's to find justice. The international community has repeatedly voiced concern about these issues. The United Nations, the European Union, and human rights watchdogs, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have all condemned rising settler violence and called for independent investigations. In recent months, the United States Embassy in Jerusalem has publicly condemned attacks by settlers, particularly a high-profile incident in the town of Tampa. These statements mark a slight shift in tone, but critics argue that words alone are not enough. Without concrete action, such as sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or legal proceedings, the cycle of violence is likely to continue. For the people of Sinjil and similar villages, these broader dynamics play out in everyday life. Residents describe a reality in which children are afraid to walk to school, farmers fear tending their fields, and families worry about their safety each night. The attack that killed Saif and Mohammed is, tragically, just one of many such incidents in recent years. According to a United Nations report, there were more than 130 settler attacks in May alone that resulted in injury or property damage. These are not mere statistics. Each number represents shattered families, disrupted lives, and a community living under the constant threat of violence. The funeral for Saif Musalat was a scene of both mourning and resistance. Hundreds of mourners, family, friends, neighbors, and activists gathered in the sweltering West Bank sun to pay their respects. The air was thick with grief, but also with a sense of determination. Large banners celebrated the lives of Saif and Mohammed, hailing them as martyrs, who, watered with their blood, the beloved land of Palestine. Chants for justice and freedom echoed through the village streets, underscoring the deep well of resilience among Palestinians who have endured decades of occupation and violence. As the world watched, an urgent question hung over Sinjil. Would this senseless killing finally break the cycle? Or would the tragedy quickly fade, destined to be another entry in a long chronicle of unresolved injustice? The answer, experts say, depends on what happens next, both in the region and on the international stage. The killing of Saif Musalat stands as a potential turning point, albeit a fragile one. Some analysts argue that the sheer brutality of recent attacks and the international attention they have garnered could signal a shift. There is growing impatience among global powers, including within the United States, where public opinion has evolved in recent years. Calls for accountability are now coming not only from grieving families, but also from diplomats, lawmakers, and grassroots organizations. The possibility of sanctions or other forms of pressure is being discussed in policy circles in Washington, Brussels, and beyond. Yet history warns us to temper our optimism. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is littered with moments that seemed poised to change the trajectory, only for hope to give way to disappointment. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s promised peace, but collapsed in the face of violence and mistrust. The roadmap for peace, championed by the so-called Quartet, composed of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, ultimately failed to deliver a lasting solution. Even as international outrage has occasionally led to investigations or aid for victims, meaningful change has proven elusive. Still, there are reasons not to give in to despair. History also shows that sustained advocacy and collective action can make a difference. In past years, international pressure has forced governments to investigate individual cases of violence, provide compensation to victims, or at least shine a spotlight on abuses that might otherwise go unnoticed. Grassroots movements, both in Palestine and abroad, have mobilized public opinion, organized protests, and pushed for policy changes. In the United States, for example, Palestinian American organizations and allies are lobbying Congress, demanding that American aid to Israel be conditioned on respect for human rights and international law. Experts warn, however, that if impunity continues unchecked, the consequences could be dire, not just for individual families, but for the stability of the entire region. Some warn that unchecked attacks by settlers, like the one that claimed Saif's life, could push the West Bank toward full-scale confrontation. The risk of a broader conflict is real, especially as tensions simmer in neighboring Gaza and across the region. The United Nations has made clear that the pattern of violence and lack of accountability poses a grave threat to any hope for peace. For ordinary viewers, the lessons of Saif Musalat's killing go beyond this one tragedy. His story is a stark reminder of how political decisions, international law, and global diplomacy shape the lives of ordinary people. Every headline about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hides a tapestry of human stories. Families torn apart, futures put on hold, communities living in fear but also refusing to surrender hope. As global citizens, it is vital to stay informed, to question sources, and to demand that leaders uphold their commitments to justice and human rights. Practical steps can make a difference, however small they may seem. Supporting organizations that promote peace, dialogue, and human rights helps amplify the voices of those most affected by the conflict. Educating oneself about the history, context, and current realities of the region fosters empathy and understanding. Engaging in respectful conversations, sharing accurate information, and challenging misinformation are all ways to contribute to a more informed and compassionate global community. The story of Saif Musalat also highlights the power and the limitations of collective action. In the past, sustained international pressure has forced authorities to investigate abuses, provide humanitarian aid, or at least acknowledge wrongdoing. For example, after the killing of an American peace activist in Gaza in 2003, a global campaign led to calls for transparency and accountability, even if justice was never fully served. These cases show that the path to justice is long and fraught with setbacks, but not impossible. As we reflect on Saif's story, we are left with a haunting question. Will his death finally prompt meaningful action, or will the cycle of violence and inaction grind on? The truth is that both outcomes remain possible. We have seen moments when international outrage fades into the background, replaced by the next crisis. But we have also witnessed times when persistent activism, courageous journalism, and relentless advocacy have led to real consequences for perpetrators and, occasionally, a measure of justice for victims. Behind the scenes, there are signs that the conversation is shifting. According to internal United Nations memos rarely shared with the public, diplomats now privately acknowledge that the impunity surrounding settler violence is one of the key obstacles to any lasting peace in the region. Without accountability, the cycle of violence is destined to repeat, trapping new generations in an endless loop of suffering and retaliation. If Saif's story moved you, do not let it end here. Share his story with others, educate yourself about the realities on the ground, and support efforts for justice and peace. Demand accountability from your leaders and institutions. And remember that your voice can make a difference. The world is watching, and history is shaped by those who refuse to look away. As we conclude, let us remember, every tragedy is also a call to action. Saif Musalat's life, though tragically short, can serve as a catalyst for change, if we choose to listen, to learn, and to act. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives at the intersection of global politics, economics, and technology. Together, we can demand a world where tragedies like this are neither ignored nor forgotten, but instead inspire us to build